tariff is a dreaded word in some senses, as much as President Trump calls it the best, his favorite word in the dictionary. The most obvious thing for China to do, or for any country which is facing tariffs, is to basically increase the price of their product by that amount. And this basically penalizes the US consumer. Consumers everywhere will perhaps face a tougher time as a result of this tariff war. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week we'll discuss about tariffs. As many of you would have known that the new American president, Donald Trump, has been talking about tariffs. In fact, in the run-up to the campaign, he had talked about tariffs being his favorite word. And currently, every policymaker everywhere in the world, analysts, observers of the global economy, are watching with bated breath about what Donald Trump might do on the trade front. The word tariff is a dreaded word in some senses, as much as President Trump calls it the best, his favorite word in the dictionary. Now, let's unpack what exactly is a tariff. Let's understand it with an example, because it's coming from a very real concern that President Trump is representing, which is that domestic manufacturing in US is actually slow. It's, car industry, for example, in the US is not doing as well as they would want. So let's take an example where, say, China is producing a car for $100 and the similar competing car produced by American firms is for $120. Now, tariff is a measure which serves two purposes, or it could at least serve one of them. The one thing to do when you're slapping a tariff is to say, I will protect my domestic industry. So the American car is coming at $120, the Chinese car is coming at $100, so more and more people are buying Chinese car. So what you can do is slap a 50% tariff on the Chinese car, and this would make the Chinese car more costly because it will now be $150, and you will protect the domestic industry, which is the US car industry, which is selling at $120. The other way to look at this is to earn revenues, which is to say that, okay, you are coming and selling more and more cars in America, let me make some money off it, tax that activity. And so you get a certain percentage of that sale. At present, Donald Trump is trying to do both those things. Although he has not yet slapped any tariffs, but the intention is to both earn revenues and also protect at some level the domestic industry. Now, let's understand how how countries on whom these tariffs are applied, they can respond to such tariff impositions. So there are four ways in which, broadly speaking, in which a country can respond, four different ways in which a country can respond to tariffs. Say, let's take China's example, because China is the main competitor for the United States right now. And in the previous term also, Donald Trump had actually imposed a lot of tariffs on China, and that seems to be the country of interest this year also. Now, the four main ways in which China can respond. The first is that, Chinese can say that, okay, let me absorb all this hit of $50, 50% tariff. So that's $50. Let's absorb that hit. Continue selling our car at, $100, and we will take the additional $50 on our books. We will take that hit. But let's continue selling at $100 in the US market. That is one way to go about it. It seems unlikely that any country or any producer would want to do that, but it's not unheard of. The other way to respond is to say that, okay, you're charging me $50 more, so I will just bung in those $50 into the overall price and let the US consumer have my car at $150. Remember, the US car is for $120. So initially it was uncompetitive as against the Chinese car. Now it's more it's more competitive. It's cheaper. It's 120. Now the Chinese car is 150. The third way to respond for China is to say, okay, let me not send all these cars there. Let me set up a factory in the US. That's called foreign direct investment. It's a thing that often countries do when they are imposing tariffs, is to make sure or incentivize other countries to come and invest in their country. So a Chinese company going there and setting up a factory of a Chinese car so that they can sell their cars made in the US to the US consumers, and this way they will not get slapped by a tariff. And the fourth way to respond is a all-out trade war, which is to say that the Chinese China decides that, okay, if you're going to put tariffs on our products, which we are exporting to your country, we will impose tariffs on stuff that we import from you. For example, if China is importing, say, corn or aircrafts, then they slap tariffs there. So, it becomes an all-out trade war. Now, let's look at how these things pan out typically. The first thing that a country can do is dumping. It's called dumping, which is to say that a country can actually sell its products in another country at lesser than what it makes sense to sell. So if you're making it for 100 and you sell it at 20 or 80 or 50 or whatever number less than 100, now that's called dumping. It is something that is frowned upon. There are rules in WTO that do not allow dumping to happen. But many countries have argued, in particular US, that countries like China have dumped their goods. They have excess goods and they want to destroy the industry in the US, and they come and dump all these goods at lower price. And once the industry is demolished, you over time increase prices. That is one way it can pan out. It's not unheard of, the whole dumping issue, but it's not the first port of call. The most obvious thing for China to do, or for any country which is facing tariffs, is to basically increase the price of their product by that amount. So $150 for their car. And this basically penalizes the US consumer. That is why so many academics have said that tariffs are counterproductive, that this would typically lead to Chinese cars being sold at $150, right? And that penalizes the US consumer. So you're protecting the US industry and you're maybe earning some money as a government. So both the government and the domestic producers are slightly better off, but the US consumer is the one who's paying for this. And this basically means that the prices will rise in the US for cars. It will lead to higher inflation. And a very perverse result often of such things is that, of such tariffs, is that imagine that the US domestic firms, car producers, they realize, okay, we were selling for $120. Now Chinese cars are for $150. We can always increase our prices from $120 to $140, and still be $10 short of the Chinese car and still sell more cars, be protected as an industry, and yet make more money. So what you're seeing is that the consumer is getting to pay more, ending up paying more, and without necessarily getting a better car for it. Companies tend to earn more because they can just jack up the price without necessarily being more efficient or better. And the only people benefiting are companies and government to some extent, which is getting the revenues. Now, the third way is FDI, foreign direct investment. Now, this is a manner in which China can come and start a factory in the US. Now, this depends on a number of factors. It's not terribly easy for a company in one country to get up and just find a new plant in another country. If it is very desperate, they might do it. Now, a lot of people say that the Volkswagen Group in Germany is likely to do that because they are really desperate for sales. Sales in Europe and the rest of the world are falling, and they would want US sales to continue, and they might actually, instead of getting tariffed out of the market, decide to come to US and start a new plant. But maybe a Chinese company may not decide to do that for two reasons. One, China may not actually be able to produce a car for $100 that it was doing in China in the US. Because in the US, the labor costs might be higher, input costs otherwise might be higher. So for whatever reason you were able to create a car for $100, you may not be able to create it in the US. And secondly, there is always this question of jobs. A Chinese firm or the Chinese government will wonder, why am I going to lose all these jobs in China and go and invest in the US and create jobs there? So there's always the same argument that the US has for incentivizing firms in US, China would have for itself. And the last bit is about trade war. Now, typically, this is the most, perhaps the worst part of it, an all-out trade war, which is what most economists and observers are worried about, that if President Trump starts slapping tariffs left, right, and center, then it may lead to a massive trade war where everybody is starting to jack up tariffs everywhere. It would basically mean that costs will go up across the board, first of all, because everybody would now have to pay more. So consumers across the countries will have to pay more. Secondly, it disrupts supply chains because there is a efficient flow in which things are happening, and now you put tariffs, so everybody is trying to figure out which is the best way to reduce costs. So you find new ways to do things which may not necessarily be as efficient as earlier. So that also increases costs, increases prices, leads to more inflation. And the odd part of all of this is that often tariffs don't really achieve the goal. So if the goal was, as it was when President Trump had imposed tariffs in 2018, and perhaps continues to be the case today also, is to ensure that Chinese goods do not reach the US market, cheap Chinese goods do not reach the US market, and we have more activity, domestic manufacturing activity in the US, it may not necessarily happen because, as we saw in 2018, what China did was started exporting goods instead of directly to US, it started exporting goods to countries like Mexico or Canada. Now, Mexico and Canada have a free trade agreement with the US. So the Chinese would, almost create a car and then give that product, which is almost, which is at the penultimate stage of readiness, export that product to Mexico. Mexico will export that to US under free trade. And so what happened was, while US's trade balance with China came down, so on the face of it, it was a success, its trade balance with Mexico and with Canada worsened because they were importing more goods from Mexico and Canada. So the point being that often countries find another way to channel the goods. The counter argument to that is, and what President Trump is again talking about, is to impose tariffs against Mexico and Canada also. Again, by the same logic, it just keeps becoming a bigger problem, more counterproductive for all concerned. Consumers everywhere will perhaps face a tougher time as a result of this tariff war. Producers might be better off. Governments might be better off because they get more revenue. That's the sum and substance of this whole issue.